In 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended, something really cool happened in South Carolina. The people of South Carolina elected perhaps, at the time, the most representative government in the history of all democracies. But what does most representative mean? We now know that often democracies don't always represent all their people. And this goes all the way back to like the Greeks and the Romans and pretty much everywhere. To get a truly representative democracy is hard. Take the list of people not represented in America at this point in its history. African Americans were excluded, women were excluded, Native Americans were excluded, most non property owners were excluded, and the list goes on. But the voters in South Carolina, the state that was the first to leave the Union and was actually a really hotbed for Confederate sympathizers, needed to elect a new legislature so that it could write a new constitution and then could join a changed nation. That's what all these numbers show down here. After the war was over, in order for the former Confederate states to rejoin the Union, they had to do a number of things like write a new constitution and abolish slavery. So Mississippi rejoined the Union in 1870, whereas Tennessee did back in 1866. But who were these voters then that picked perhaps the most representative state government in history? You can probably guess. With the war over and the slaves freed, most of the voters were African Americans. And in fact, that makes sense because in South Carolina in 1868, there were more African Americans than there were white Americans. And when they voted for people, representatives, that represented their interest, right? That same thing goes on today. If you want lower taxes, you vote for someone that pledges to lower taxes. If you want a law changed, you vote for someone that pledges to change a law. And as an 8th grade student, if you want the school policy changed so that you can play Animal Crossing at school during lunch, you should vote for a student council representative, put together a policy, and do that. BTW, I am totally suggesting that you do that because I want to see what this game is all about. I know you guys all play it, and I still don't have a Switch, so maybe I can borrow one of yours. But anyway, back to South Carolina. In 1868, I got a little ahead of myself, 3 years after the war ended, it elected a legislature that was composed of mainly African Americans. There were 76 African Americans and 48 white men in that legislature. Now, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, right, you want the best people for the job. You want the best people representing you. That was true back in 1868, and that same thing should be true today. Well, South Carolina's job and America's job following the end of the Civil War was to, among other things, make itself into a fair interracial society that truly gave liberty to all its people. It needed to reconstruct itself, hence the term reconstruction, and give it, as Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom. And who better to do that and to help with that than the people that had suffered the worst and were deprived the longest of any semblance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I mean, that sounds exactly like a case of walk a mile in my shoes. And it was an enormous task. But it was being approached by an incredible group of people, black and white. And they wanted to create a truly free republic and an interracial society. And how cool would that be? Because remember, nowhere in the world at this time did a legislature more accurately reflect its people. So the people in South Carolina and all across the South and North picked representatives that they thought could get the job done, and the representatives in South Carolina were legit. Take Robert Eliot. He studied law at Eton, which is a top-notch boarding school in England. Think of like, you know that place where Robin Williams taught the kids at Dead Poets Society? Like, it was a really, really good school. I mean, he was brilliant. He was fluent in French and Spanish. Later, he will go on to serve South Carolina in the House of Representatives, and he will promote a bill to fight against the Ku Klux Klan. And Robert Small's story is just as awesome. He was a slave in South Carolina when the Civil War was going on, but he and his family escaped to freedom in a pretty cool fashion. Smalls commandeered a Confederate ship in the harbor and sailed into a Union harbor all while the Confederates are shooting at him, gives the Union this huge warship, and it was super cool. And eventually, President Lincoln heard about Robert Smalls, and that kind of, like, in one step, convinced Lincoln that African American soldiers should be allowed to fight in the Union Army. They weren't at first. So that's Robert Smalls, and that's Robert Eliot. And the rest of the delegation was equally significant. You had delegates who 3 years earlier were slaves, and now they were legislators. You had poor and wealthy whites. You had educated and non-educated men. Sadly, no women. We're not quite there yet. You had some in the delegation who couldn't even read or write, but honestly, that didn't matter. because the people called on this group to change their state and to change their country. And changes were occurring, good changes, especially when it came to the laws. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment will collectively ban slavery, ensure equal protection for all, and then give African Americans and all citizens the right to vote. Well, not all citizens, but more citizens. And there were more legislatures like this in the South and the North as well that were doing incredible things following the war. Reconstruction legislatures will vote for public schools, they'll build new roads, and they'll help to reconstruct the war-torn South. And there was a chance that that South Carolina legislature could have been the norm. There was a chance that all of these legislatures could collectively reconstruct America and remake America into what I think it was always meant to be. But here's the thing, that chance was taken away, and by 1876, most of those legislatures were gone. Not even gone, they were illegal. Why? When we read an excerpt from our text, it says that those hopeful crowds that swirled around the Charleston Clubhouse of January of 1868, when that incredible legislature was meeting, will not see a new era, and they will not live in a fair interracial society. Well, why? Well, there were problems with Reconstruction. Part of it were the presidents in office. We'll learn about them. Part of it was the violence inflicted on blacks in Memphis and New Orleans, and we'll learn about them. And part of it will lie with the rise of a bunch of idiots who will pretend to be Confederate ghosts, wore stupid white hats, and called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. We will learn about them, and we will also make fun of them in the process. I will start right now by scribbling all over their face. But in my opinion, the biggest problem will lie with the hearts and minds of everyday people, both Northerners and Southerners. Let me see if I can try to explain what I mean by that. Laws can be changed. We saw that. And hearts and minds can be changed. We saw that. But which do you think takes longer? 1865 is the year the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was passed and slavery was banned. 1619 is the year that slaves arrived in Virginia. 1865 minus 1619 is 246 years. That's a long time. If you think of it this way, the United States of America is, I think, 242 years old. So slavery has actually existed on the North American continent longer than the US has even been a country. How many generations is 246 years? Well, I just Googled a generation, and Google says that a generation is 30 years. So 246 divided by 30 is 8 generations, 8.2. Which means that the idea of slavery and the idea that one race was superior to another lasted for 8 generations. Now, not all believed it, but enough did to make it a problem still today. How long is 8 generations? Well, if you were a slave that was newly freed in Virginia following the war, there's a chance that and I have to read this closely, your great, 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 great grandfather and grandmother were slaves. That's a long time. But now, finally, with the war over and the laws changed, America could set out to be what we now know it needs to be. Reconstruction. The period historians describe as lasting from the end of the Civil War in 1865 through 1876, the year Hayes is elected president, failed. Our book says that. Our college book says that. Books say that. And it's true. It failed. Why? What were the problems with Reconstruction? Well, the amendments are going to be construed. Northerners will go wary of interfering in the South. Black codes, awful black codes will be passed, and Jim Crow became a sad thing. And this led to legislatures like the one in South Carolina becoming illegal. Perhaps the most representative government in the world would be gone within 10 years. Local and state laws, supported by people, repressed those governments. Bad people did bad things, and too few good people did what needed to be done following the Civil War. Good things were done, don't forget that. Good things are being done, don't forget that. But again, Reconstruction did not live up to the lofty ideals it set for itself. The laws were changed, we know that. But we also know that the hearts and minds weren't changed. Because if they all were, then Dr. Martin Luther King would not have had to give his I Have a Dream speech 100 years on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, 100 years after Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation, because this was a thing. A 6-year-old Ruby Bridges would not have needed an armed escort to attend William Franz Elementary School in New Orleans, Louisiana, because this was a thing. And Rosa Parks would not have needed to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, because this was a thing. And don't think that because these photos are in black and white, and like 50 years or so old that the hearts and minds have changed. They haven't. It's 2020, and you know who this is. It's 2020, and this probably showed up on your Instagram. And it's 2020, and you should be demanding justice for her. All right, the job started back in 1865, eventually led to laws being changed. But again, what about the hearts and minds? The hearts and minds of everybody, including you guys as 8th graders. We should want these legislatures of 1868 back, because the legislature was a testament to what America was supposed to be. And don't think that this is outside of your realm of doing anything good, right? Remember Gandalf. Even though The Hobbit was a terrible movie, I love this quote. Saruman believes it is only great power that can hold evil in check, but that is not what I have found. I have found that it is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. So let's look at Reconstruction.